There is a quiet kind of loss that rarely gets named. It doesn't come with shouting, slammed doors, or dramatic goodbyes. It happens slowly, almost politely. One day the empath stops explaining. Another day they stop reaching out. Eventually they stop showing up, not because they stopped caring, but because caring began to cost them their sense of self. Empaths don't disappear suddenly. They fade after being repeatedly asked to betray their own nervous system for the comfort of others. When sensitivity is treated as weakness, when boundaries are punished, and when love is only welcomed if it's self-sacrificing, something inside the empath learns that survival requires retreat. Today we're talking about what actually makes an empath leave, not anger, not pride, but exhaustion of the soul. An empath doesn't need constant praise, but they do need reality to be acknowledged. Emotional invalidation is subtle, and that's what makes it so dangerous. It sounds like being told you're too sensitive when your body is actually responding to threat. It looks like having your pain minimized, reframed, or rushed past because it makes other people uncomfortable. Over time, the empath learns that their internal experience is not welcome, that their feelings are an inconvenience rather than information. This creates a split inside them, where what they feel and what they're allowed to express begin to drift apart. Empaths are wired to sense emotional undercurrents, not as a skill they chose, but as a survival adaptation. Many learned early in life that paying attention to tone, mood, and silence kept them safe. So when their perceptions are dismissed, it doesn't just hurt their feelings, it destabilizes their sense of reality. They begin to question their intuition, to doubt their own body, to wonder if the ache in their chest or the tightness in their throat is somehow wrong. Invalidation teaches the empath that self-trust is dangerous. What makes this especially painful is that empaths often invalidate themselves long before anyone else does. They've been trained to empathize outward, to understand everyone else's perspective, to excuse harmful behavior because someone didn't mean it that way. When others reinforce this pattern by denying the empath's emotional truth, it deepens the internal erasure. The empath becomes fluent in self-abandonment, skilled at overriding their own needs to preserve connection. Chronic invalidation doesn't arrive as cruelty, it often arrives as logic. Be rational, don't take it personally. You're overthinking. It's not that serious. These phrases don't sound violent, but they disconnect the empath from their lived experience. The nervous system hears them as a command to shut down, and the body always keeps score. Suppressed emotions don't disappear. They convert into fatigue, resentment, numbness, and eventually withdrawal. An empath who is repeatedly invalidated will first try harder. They'll explain more clearly, soften their tone, shrink their needs. They'll search for the right words that might finally make someone understand. But when understanding never comes, something shifts. The empath stops sharing not because they have nothing to say, but because they've learned it's not safe to be heard. Silence becomes adaptive. This is where disappearance begins. Not as punishment, not as manipulation, but as regulation. The empath system chooses distance because proximity has become dysregulating. When emotional reality is denied, connection becomes a threat rather than a refuge. Leaving isn't about giving up on people. It's about returning to oneself. Invalidation also teaches the empath that love is conditional. You can be accepted as long as you're calm, agreeable, and easy to manage. But your grief, anger, or confusion must be edited. Over time, this conditions the empath to perform wellness rather than inhabit it. They smile while breaking inside. They show up while slowly vanishing. What's rarely acknowledged is that empaths don't leave when they're angry. They leave when they're empty. When the cost of staying outweighs the pain of separation. When being misunderstood hurts more than being alone. And because they are deeply attuned, they often sense this long before others do. They feel the erosion happening quietly, cell by cell. Emotional invalidation severs connection not in a single moment, but through repetition. Each dismissal is a small cut. Each minimization is a reminder that their inner world is unsupported. Eventually, the empath realizes that staying means continuing to deny their own truth. And for someone whose entire being is organized around authenticity and feeling, that kind of betrayal is unbearable. So when an empath disappears, it's not because they didn't care enough. It's because they cared so deeply that they could no longer survive in a space where their emotional existence was treated as negotiable. Here you go, same tone, same depth, same rules followed. Boundary violations rarely announce themselves as harm. They arrive wearing the language of closeness, loyalty, and concern. An empath is told that love means access, that care means availability, that closeness requires transparency at all times. When they try to assert a limit, it's met not with curiosity but with hurt, offense, or moral pressure. The message is subtle but clear: your boundaries are a rejection of me. For an empath whose nervous system is wired for connection, this is an unbearable dilemma. Empaths often confuse boundaries with abandonment because that's how boundaries were framed early in life. If they needed space, someone withdrew love. If they said no, they were met with disappointment or emotional coldness. So when someone crosses their limits and calls it love, it feels familiar. It feels like home even when it's harmful. The empath learns to override their own discomfort in order to preserve attachment. Boundary violations disguised as love look like constant emotional access. You should always be there for me. If you cared, you'd understand. Why are you changing? These statements don't ask, they assume entitlement. They don't recognize the empath as a separate nervous system with its own limits, but as an emotional resource meant to regulate someone else. Over time, the empath stops asking themselves what they need and starts asking what will keep the peace. What makes this especially damaging is that empaths feel other people's discomfort as their own. When someone reacts poorly to a boundary, the empath experiences guilt, anxiety, and self-doubt. Their body responds as if they've done something wrong, so they backtrack, they explain, they overgive. The boundary dissolves, and resentment quietly takes its place. Love without boundaries is not intimacy, it's fusion, and fusion is exhausting. The empath becomes porous, absorbing stress, chaos, and unmet needs that were never theirs to carry. They mistake endurance for devotion. But the body knows the difference. Chronic boundary violations lead to burnout, numbness, and a feeling of being invaded from the inside out. An empath will tolerate boundary violations far longer than most people. They'll intellectualize them. They'll empathize with the violator's pain. They'll say they don't know better, they've been through a lot. But empathy without self-protection becomes self-erasure. Eventually, the empath realizes that every time they say yes when they mean no, something inside them collapses. The tragedy is that when empaths finally enforce boundaries, they're often accused of becoming cold, distant, or selfish. The very act that could have preserved the relationship is framed as betrayal. This confirms the empath's deepest fear that being whole means being alone. So instead of fighting, they retreat. Instead of arguing, they disappear. Disappearance is not a strategy, it's a last resort. When boundaries are repeatedly violated, distance becomes the only remaining boundary that can't be crossed. The empath doesn't vanish to hurt anyone. They vanish to stop hurting themselves. Space becomes the only place where their nervous system can breathe again. Boundary violations also teach the empath that their worth lies in what they provide, not who they are. When they stop providing, the connection weakens. This realization is devastating. It forces the empath to confront a painful truth: they were valued for their availability, not their authenticity. And once that truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. So the empath withdraws slowly. They respond less, they share less. They stop offering emotional labor that was never reciprocated. To the outside world, it looks like detachment. Internally, it feels like survival. They are not building walls out of bitterness, but out of necessity. When love consistently ignores limits, the empath's body makes a decision the mind has been avoiding. It chooses absence over violation. It chooses silence over explanation. It chooses disappearance over continued self-betrayal. One-sided emotional labor drains an empath in ways that are invisible to everyone except their nervous system. It begins quietly, almost nobly. The empath becomes the listener, the supporter, the translator of feelings. They notice shifts in mood before words are spoken. They remember what hurts you, what soothes you, what you avoid. At first, this feels like love in action. Giving comes naturally to them. Attunement feels like purpose. But emotional labor becomes one-sided when care only flows in one direction. When the empath is expected to hold space, regulate emotions, and offer understanding without receiving the same presence in return. Their feelings are postponed. Their exhaustion is ignored. Their pain is treated as something that can wait. Over time, the empath becomes the emotional infrastructure of the relationship, unseen but essential, until they begin to crumble. What makes this especially complex is that empaths rarely ask for reciprocity. Many learned early that being needed was safer than being needy. They discovered that love arrived when they were useful, when they anticipated needs, when they stayed emotionally available no matter the cost. So they continue giving even as their inner reserves run dry. They convince themselves that this is just how relationships work. One-sided emotional labor often hides behind phrases like "you're just better at this," or "you're so strong," or "I don't know what I'd do without you." These sound like compliments, but they quietly assign responsibility. The empath becomes the container for emotions others don't want to process themselves. Anger, anxiety, confusion, grief all get outsourced. The empath absorbs it, metabolizes it, and offers clarity back, while their own emotional world remains unattended. Over time, the empath stops checking in with themselves. Their internal questions shift from "how am I feeling" to "how are they doing?" Their identity becomes organized around responsiveness rather than authenticity. They are always available, always understanding, always present. But presence without mutuality becomes depletion. The body begins to signal what the mind ignores. Chronic fatigue sets in. A sense of heaviness follows every interaction. Joy feels distant. The empath may feel resentful and then ashamed for feeling resentful, because they believe love should not keep score. But the body always keeps score. Emotional labor that is not shared becomes a form of invisible exploitation. What's painful is that when empaths finally express their needs, they're often met with confusion or defensiveness. "You never said anything, I didn't know you needed that. Why are you changing now?" This response reinforces the pattern. The empath learns that their needs disrupt the dynamic, that asking for support destabilizes the relationship, so they retreat inward again. One-sided emotional labor also erodes intimacy. True connection requires vulnerability on both sides. But when one person is always holding space, they are rarely held. They become the therapist, the anchor, the safe place, but no one asks who keeps them safe. Loneliness can exist even in constant connection, especially when no one sees the empath as someone who also needs care. Eventually, the empath realizes that they are exhausted not because life is hard, but because they are carrying more than their share. They are doing emotional work for adults who were never taught to do it themselves. They are managing reactions, softening truths, and preventing conflict at the expense of their own truth. This awareness is destabilizing because it forces a reckoning with how much of their identity has been built around over-functioning. When an empath stops doing one-sided emotional labor, the relationship often falters. Conversations feel emptier. Crises escalate. The absence of their constant regulation is suddenly noticeable, and instead of curiosity there is blame. You're distant. You don't care like you used to. This confirms what the empath has sensed all along. Their value is tied to what they provided, not who they were. So the empath begins to withdraw. Not dramatically, not with accusations, but with quiet disengagement. They stop anticipating, they stop fixing. They stop absorbing what was never theirs to hold. To others this feels like abandonment. To the empath it feels like relief mixed with grief. Disappearance is not a rejection of love. It is the refusal to continue loving in a way that requires self-neglect. When emotional labor is no longer shared, distance becomes the only way the empath can reclaim balance. They are not choosing coldness. They are choosing sustainability. Guilt is one of the most powerful tools for controlling an empath because it bypasses logic and goes straight to the nervous system. An empath doesn't need to be threatened or commanded. They only need to feel that they've caused harm. The moment guilt is activated, their attention turns outward. How did I hurt you? What did I do wrong? How can I fix this? Guilt pulls them out of their own body and places responsibility for someone else's emotional state squarely on their shoulders. When guilt is used as control, it is rarely loud. It's expressed through disappointment, silence, wounded tones, and subtle accusations. I guess I just don't matter that much to you. I wouldn't have done that to you, after everything I've done for you. These statements don't ask for repair, they demand self-sacrifice. The empath learns that asserting their needs will be followed by emotional consequences, and so they begin to associate self-care with harm. What makes empaths especially vulnerable is their heightened sense of responsibility. Many grew up in environments where they were emotionally parentified, where they learned to manage the moods of adults before they learned to understand their own. They became experts at reading emotional cues and intervening early to prevent conflict. Guilt was often the price of peace. So when someone uses guilt in adulthood, it doesn't feel manipulative, it feels familiar. Guilt used as control trains the empath to prioritize harmony over truth. They learn to silence discomfort because speaking it would cause pain. They choose compliance over authenticity because disagreement feels like cruelty. Over time, they lose access to healthy anger, the kind that signals a boundary has been crossed. Instead, anger gets turned inward and becomes shame. The body responds to guilt with collapse. The chest tightens. The shoulders slump. The voice softens. The empath system goes into appeasement mode. They apologize even when they've done nothing wrong. They over-explain. They reverse decisions they were clear about moments earlier. Each time this happens, the message is reinforced as your needs are dangerous, your limits are hurtful, your autonomy is selfish. Guilt also distorts reality. When someone consistently frames themselves as the injured party, the empath begins to question their own perceptions. Maybe I am being unfair. Maybe I'm asking for too much. Maybe I should be more grateful. This erosion of self-trust is slow but devastating. The empath becomes dependent on external validation to determine whether their feelings are legitimate. What's particularly painful is that guilt often masquerades as vulnerability. Someone shares how hurt they are, how abandoned they feel, how much they're struggling. The empath responds with care, not realizing that their compassion is being used to override their boundaries. The line between empathy and obligation blurs. Care becomes compulsory. Over time, the empath starts to feel trapped. Every choice feels wrong. If they stay, they betray themselves. If they leave, they are made to feel cruel, heartless, or ungrateful. This double bind creates chronic anxiety and emotional paralysis. The empath lives in a constant state of self-monitoring, scanning for signs that they've disappointed someone. Eventually something breaks. Not dramatically, but quietly. The empath becomes numb to guilt because they've been saturated by it for too long. What once motivated connection now triggers exhaustion. The same guilt that once kept them engaged begins to push them away. The body recognizes that this emotional economy is unsustainable. When guilt is consistently used as control, the empath learns that love is conditional upon self-erasure. They are loved when they comply, when they accommodate, when they sacrifice. They are punished with withdrawal or blame when they don't. This realization is deeply disillusioning. It reframes the entire relationship. Disappearance becomes the only way to exit the guilt loop. Distance breaks the emotional feedback cycle. Without constant exposure to guilt-inducing cues, the empath's nervous system begins to recalibrate. They start to hear their own voice again, faint at first, then clearer. Space allows them to feel without immediately reacting. To the person who relied on guilt, the empath's withdrawal feels sudden and unfair. But from the inside, it has been building for years. Each guilt-laden interaction was a small withdrawal from the empath's emotional bank. When the account is empty, there is nothing left to give. The empath does not disappear to punish anyone. They disappear because guilt has made presence unbearable. They are not rejecting responsibility, they are rejecting manipulation disguised as emotional need. Distance becomes the only place where they are allowed to exist without apology. Unacknowledged trauma triggers create a unique kind of harm because they don't look intentional, yet their impact is profound. An empath can endure a great deal of pain when it is named, owned, and repaired. What becomes unbearable is when their nervous system is repeatedly activated and then dismissed, denied, or misunderstood. Trauma lives in the body, not in the story. So when a situation, tone, or behavior echoes an earlier wound, the empath's reaction is not an overreaction, it is memory surfacing through sensation. Many empaths carry trauma that formed before they had language. Their bodies learned patterns of threat long before their minds could make sense of them. Raised voices, emotional withdrawal, unpredictability, or even subtle shifts in energy can activate a cascade of stress responses. The empath may suddenly feel small, frozen, hyper-alert, or overwhelmed without fully understanding why. When these reactions are met with confusion or impatience, the empath feels exposed and alone inside their own body. Unacknowledged triggers are often mislabeled as sensitivity, drama, or moodiness. Why are you reacting like this? That was a joke, you're living in the past. These responses communicate that the empath's internal experience is inconvenient. Instead of curiosity, there is correction. Instead of safety, there is pressure to self-regulate in isolation. The empath learns that their trauma responses must be hidden to maintain connection. What makes this especially painful is that empaths are often deeply aware of other people's triggers. They remember what hurts others and instinctively avoid it. They soften their words, adjust their tone, and anticipate reactions. When that same care is not extended to them, it creates an imbalance that feels profoundly unsafe. The empath is asked to be trauma-informed while existing in trauma-blind environments. When trauma triggers go unacknowledged, the empath begins to internalize blame. They tell themselves they should be over this by now. They criticize their own nervous system for reacting. They push themselves to tolerate situations that are dysregulating because they don't want to be difficult. This self-gaslighting deepens the original wound, reinforcing the belief that their pain is a personal failing rather than a survival response. The body, however, does not negotiate. Each unacknowledged trigger leaves residue. Cortisol stays elevated. Muscles remain tense. Sleep becomes shallow. The empath may feel chronically on edge or emotionally numb, swinging between hypervigilance and shutdown. These are not character flaws, they are adaptive responses to repeated exposure without repair. What's rarely understood is that healing does not require perfect behavior from others, but it does require recognition. A simple acknowledgement can restore safety. I see that this was hard for you. I didn't mean to activate that. Let's slow down. Without this, the empath's nervous system remains in a constant state of defense. Over time, the cost of staying connected outweighs the benefit. Unacknowledged trauma triggers also distort communication. The empath may struggle to articulate what's happening because trauma responses are pre-verbal. They might say, I don't know why this is bothering me so much, hoping for understanding. When that uncertainty is met with dismissal, the empath learns that clarity is required before care is offered. Since trauma rarely comes with neat explanations, care becomes inaccessible. Eventually, the empath starts to avoid situations that trigger them. They withdraw from conversations, gatherings, or relationships that consistently activate old wounds. This avoidance is not avoidance of people. It is avoidance of dysregulation. The body chooses distance because proximity has become associated with threat. What hurts most is that from the outside, this withdrawal looks disproportionate. Others may not see the accumulated impact of countless small activations. They see a single reaction and judge it in isolation. The empath feels unseen not just emotionally, but somatically. Their body's wisdom is ignored. Over time, the empath stops trying to explain their triggers. Explanation requires vulnerability, and vulnerability without safety becomes re-traumatizing. Silence feels safer than repeatedly justifying pain. Distance feels kinder than asking for accommodations that never come. When trauma triggers are consistently unacknowledged, the empath's nervous system makes a clear calculation. It cannot heal in the same environment that keeps activating it. No amount of love, loyalty, or intention can override that biological truth. So the empath begins to disappear not in anger but in self-protection. They leave spaces where their reactions are pathologized instead of understood. They choose environments where their bodies can soften rather than brace. This withdrawal is not about blame, it is about regulation. Healing requires safety, and safety requires being believed. The empath does not disappear because they are fragile. They disappear because they are finally listening to what their body has been saying all along. Overexposure to chaos overwhelms an empath not because they are weak, but because their nervous system is highly permeable. Chaos is not just noise or conflict, it is unpredictability, emotional volatility, unresolved crises that never settle. An empath doesn't simply witness chaos, they absorb it. Their body tracks shifts in energy, tension in voices, sudden changes in mood. What others can tune out, the empath takes in as raw data. At first, the empath adapts. They become flexible, responsive, alert. They learn how to move around emotional landmines, how to soothe escalation before it explodes, how to stay calm when others are dysregulated. This adaptability is often praised. You're so grounding. You're the calm one. You hold everything together. But what's rarely asked is what this constant vigilance costs them. Chaos keeps the nervous system in a state of anticipation. The empath is never fully at rest because something always feels like it's about to happen. Even in moments of calm, the body doesn't relax, it braces. Shoulders stay tight, breathing stays shallow. Attention remains outward, scanning for signs of disruption. Over time, this hyperattunement becomes exhausting. Empaths often grow up in chaotic environments, where stability was inconsistent and emotional unpredictability was normal. They learned that staying alert was a form of safety. So when chaos appears in adulthood, it feels familiar, even compelling. They may mistake intensity for connection, urgency for importance. Leaving chaos can feel disloyal, as if calm is a kind of abandonment. Overexposure to chaos also erodes the empath's sense of time and self. There is always a crisis, always something that needs immediate attention. Their own needs are postponed indefinitely. I'll rest later. I'll deal with my feelings after this settles. But it never settles. Chaos feeds on urgency, and the empath becomes trapped in a cycle of constant response. What makes this particularly damaging is that chaos often disguises itself as depth. Big emotions, dramatic narratives, perpetual emergencies can feel meaningful. The empath feels needed, essential. But being needed is not the same as being safe. Over time, the empath realizes that chaos demands energy without offering restoration. The body begins to protest. Brain fog sets in. Irritability surfaces. Small things feel overwhelming. The empath may feel disconnected from joy, creativity, and presence. Their internal world becomes as noisy as the external one. This is not burnout from doing too much. It is burnout from never being allowed to settle. Chaos also blurs boundaries. When everything is urgent, nothing is prioritized. The empath is expected to be available at all times, emotionally and mentally. There is little respect for rhythms, rest, or recovery. Any attempt to slow down is met with escalation. Any request for space is interpreted as abandonment. The empath learns that peace provokes panic in chaotic systems. At some point, the empath notices a profound mismatch. Their body craves slowness, predictability, and regulation, while their environment thrives on instability. This mismatch creates chronic stress. The empath may start dissociating, emotionally checking out while physically remaining present. This numbness is not indifference, it is the nervous system's last defense. Overexposure to chaos also distorts the empath's sense of responsibility. They begin to believe that if they leave, everything will fall apart. That their presence is the only thing holding the system together. This belief keeps them tethered long after their body has signaled enough. They confuse endurance with loyalty. But the nervous system has limits. No amount of empathy can regulate an environment that refuses regulation. No amount of love can compensate for constant instability. Eventually, the empath system seeks relief not through confrontation but through distance. Disappearance becomes a form of detox. Away from chaos, the empath's body begins to recalibrate. Sleep deepens. Breath slows. Thoughts become clearer. This contrast is startling. It reveals how much energy was being spent simply surviving the environment. What once felt normal now feels intolerable. To those still immersed in chaos, the empath's withdrawal feels abrupt, even cruel. Why now? Why can't you handle this anymore? But from the inside, the empath has been drowning quietly for a long time. Each crisis layered on top of the last, each unresolved conflict tightening the nervous system further. The empath does not disappear because they lack resilience. They disappear because resilience without recovery becomes self-destruction. Chaos may feel alive, intense, and meaningful, but for an empath, prolonged exposure becomes a slow erosion of self. So they choose quiet. They choose predictability. They choose spaces where their nervous system is not constantly hijacked. This choice is not a rejection of others, but an allegiance to their own regulation, because peace is not emptiness. It is the absence of threat. Loss of self-trust is one of the most devastating experiences for an empath because their intuition is not just a preference, it is a primary way they navigate the world. Empaths rely on felt sense, subtle signals, and internal knowing to orient themselves. When that inner compass is repeatedly questioned, dismissed, or overridden, the empath becomes disoriented at a deep level. They begin to doubt not only their judgments, but their perception of reality itself. Self-trust erodes slowly. It happens every time an empath is told they're imagining things, reading too much into situations, or misinterpreting intentions. When their instincts alert them to discomfort, and they are encouraged to ignore it, they learn to betray their own signals. Over time, they stop listening to the body's warnings and start deferring to external voices for validation. What makes this particularly harmful is that empaths are often accurate in their perceptions. They sense inconsistencies, emotional incongruence, unspoken tension, but accuracy does not protect them when those perceptions are inconvenient to others. Instead of being explored, their insights are minimized. The empath learns that seeing clearly can cost them connection. Repeated invalidation creates an internal split. One part of the empath still feels and senses, while another part polices those feelings, asking, "Are you sure? Don't overact, maybe you're wrong." This internalized doubt is exhausting. It turns every decision into a negotiation. The empath becomes hesitant, second-guessing even simple choices. Loss of self-trust also makes empaths vulnerable to manipulation. When you don't trust your own intuition, you rely on others to define reality for you. You accept explanations that don't sit right. You stay in situations that feel off because you can't prove why. The empath learns to override discomfort in favor of logic, reassurance, or authority. The body reacts to this disconnection with anxiety. When intuition is suppressed, the nervous system stays activated without clear direction. There is a constant sense of unease, a feeling that something is wrong but cannot be named. This chronic ambiguity is deeply destabilizing. The empath may feel restless, foggy, or stuck in indecision. Loss of self-trust also silences boundaries. It becomes harder to say no when you're not sure your no is justified. The empath asks themselves, am I being unreasonable? This uncertainty leads to over-accommodation. They give more time, more energy, more access than feels safe, hoping clarity will arrive later. It rarely does. What's painful is that self-trust is often lost in relationships where the empath is encouraged to prioritize harmony over honesty. They are praised for being easygoing, understanding, flexible. But flexibility without grounding leads to collapse. The empath becomes so adaptable that they lose contact with what they actually want or need. Eventually, the empath notices a growing distance from themselves. They feel disconnected from their desires, their anger, their joy. Life feels muted, decisions feel heavy. This numbness is not depression, it is self-protection after too many internal betrayals. The system shuts down access to intuition because it has not been safe to use. At some point, a quiet realization emerges. Staying in environments that undermine self-trust requires constant self-doubt. Leaving, though painful, offers the possibility of reconnection. Distance becomes a way to hear one's own voice again without interruption. When an empath steps away, it is often the first act of self-trust they've made in a long time. Choosing absence over confusion restores clarity. Away from constant questioning, their intuition begins to resurface. They start noticing what feels right, what feels wrong, without immediately dismissing it. To others, this withdrawal looks like avoidance or withdrawal from responsibility, but internally it feels like coming home. The empath is not running from relationships, they are running toward coherence. They are reclaiming the right to believe their own experience. Loss of self-trust makes presence painful. Every interaction becomes a test, every feeling a debate. Disappearance offers relief from that internal noise. It creates space where intuition can breathe again, where the body's signals are no longer up for negotiation. The empath disappears not because they lack courage, but because staying would require continued self-betrayal. Rebuilding self-trust demands environments that honor internal knowing, and until such environments exist, distance becomes the most honest choice they can make. Silence as self-preservation is often misunderstood because it doesn't look like strength in the way people expect strength to look. It looks like withdrawal, hesitation, absence. But for an empath, silence is rarely passive. It is an active decision made by a nervous system that has spoken, explained, clarified, and pleaded for understanding too many times without being met. Silence is what remains when words have been exhausted and presence has become unsafe. Empaths tend to believe in communication. They try to talk things through, to name feelings carefully, to choose language that won't escalate or wound. They give context, nuance, and benefit of the doubt. When something hurts, they don't immediately leave. They try to make themselves understood. Silence only appears after this effort has failed repeatedly. It is not the first response, it is the last refuge. What pushes an empath into silence is not conflict itself, but the absence of repair. When speaking leads to defensiveness, minimization, or reversal of blame, the empath's body learns that expression increases threat rather than resolving it. Each attempt to speak that ends in misunderstanding tightens the nervous system. Eventually, the body stops offering words because words no longer feel protective. Silence becomes a way to regulate. When an empath stops explaining, their breathing slows, their muscles soften, their heart rate steadies. This is not avoidance, it is biology. The nervous system recognizes that engagement leads to dysregulation, while disengagement restores balance. Silence is not emptiness, it is containment. Many empaths were not allowed silence earlier in life. They were required to respond, to reassure, to smooth things over. Silence was interpreted as defiance or withdrawal of love, so choosing silence later in life can feel both relieving and terrifying. There is often guilt attached. The empath worries they are being cruel, cold, or immature. But beneath that guilt is a deeper truth: speaking has become too costly. Silence also protects clarity. When an empath is constantly explaining themselves, they are often pulled into defending feelings rather than honoring them. Silence removes the need to justify internal experience. It creates a space where feelings can exist without being interrogated or reshaped to fit someone else's comfort. In silence, the empath can feel without immediately translating. What others often miss is that silence is not the absence of care. It is care redirected inward. The empath still feels deeply. They still notice, still understand, still hold complexity. They have simply stopped offering that inner world to people who treat it as something to manage rather than respect. Silence as self-preservation often follows a pattern. The empath speaks less, they respond later. They keep answers short, they stop initiating emotionally loaded conversations. This gradual quieting is not meant to punish. It is a way of testing safety. Can I exist here without overfunctioning? Can I be present without explaining myself into exhaustion? When the answer is no, silence deepens. It becomes distance. Not because the empath doesn't have more to say, but because saying more would require reopening wounds that never healed. Silence draws a line where words failed to create one. There is also grief in this silence. The empath mourns the connection they hoped could be different. Silence holds disappointment, unspoken longing, and the sadness of realizing that being fully known may not be possible in this space. It is not a triumphant withdrawal. It is a sober one. Silence can be misinterpreted as indifference, but indifference has no ache. Silence carries weight. It carries restraint. It carries the echo of conversations that never landed. For an empath, silence is often chosen precisely because they still care, and caring has become too painful to express safely. In silence, the empath reclaims authorship over their energy. They stop leaking attention into dynamics that drain them. They begin to notice how much life force was being spent managing reactions, anticipating misunderstandings, and repairing what they didn't break. Silence closes those channels. Over time, silence can become a bridge rather than a wall. It allows the empath to reconnect with their own rhythms, preferences, and internal signals. Without constant engagement, they rediscover what feels true. This reconnection often brings clarity about which relationships can tolerate authenticity and which depend on self-silencing to survive. When an empath finally disappears, silence has already been there for a long time. Disappearance is simply silence made visible. It is the final boundary when all other boundaries were ignored. It is the body saying no more exposure, no more explanation, no more self-erasure. Silence as self-preservation is not the absence of voice. It is the refusal to keep using a voice in places where it is not received. It is the wisdom of knowing that sometimes the most honest response is to stop responding at all.